morning, everybody. Good to have you all with us. So, I wonder if you've ever had an experience like this, one of those experiences where you just felt like you were pushed to the limits. And maybe it was a physical limit that you ran into. Maybe it was more like an emotional, like you were pushed to your emotional limits or whatever it was. But maybe you just had one of those experiences where you just felt like you were pushed to the limits. So this happened to me. One of the times that happened to me, I thought back to my experience in college. So my junior year at Taylor University, I decided to go out and join the soccer team, and I made the team. So I mean, I guess that means I was a collegiate athlete, which really sounds way more impressive than it really was because I mean, this was a tiny campus that both Amanda and I attended, and I mean, pretty much anybody with a pulse made it onto the team. I mean, you could just walk onto the team. They were always begging guys to come out and just fill the roster. And so I remember at one point we were literally teaching a few of the new guys like how not to pick up the ball while you're playing soccer. So I mean, everybody made the team, and so I played my junior and senior year, and I remember showing up to the very first day of conditioning drills my junior year. And I mean, the guy that ran these practices, he wasn't even our soccer coach, but he was our conditioning coach, and he was one of those guys that everybody loved. He also happened to be our athletic director. He was a professor. He taught some classes. He also coached other sports, and he was just one of those guys that everybody loved, and I loved him too. I mean, he was a great guy, but I saw a whole different side of him come out in those conditioning practices, a side that was really not all that likable at all because this guy made us run and run and run like nonstop for 2 hours every day for 2 weeks, he pushed us to our physical limits every single day. And I played sports in high school. I played basketball. I ran cross country at one point. So I was no stranger to conditioning drills and things like that. But this was on a whole other level. And I don't think I have ever been as physically exhausted as I was. I mean, in my entire life, I don't think I've ever been that exhausted as I was after that first day of conditioning practice my junior year of soccer. In fact, I think I died that day, like literally died in that moment, I'm just being dramatic, but anyway, there was a moment. Obviously didn't die, but there was a moment where I think we all kind of hit our breaking point about the same time in the middle of the same drill. I'll try not to be too graphic with this, but I mean, I was about midway through the workout, we all dropped, and every single one of us regretted eating breakfast that morning. So yeah, pretty bad. But anyway, that wasn't even the worst part of that entire experience. The worst part of that experience, the first day of conditioning practice, was the fact that for like what felt like the last hour of that practice, our coach lined us up and he would say, okay, last drill, and we're going to go strong. We're going to finish strong. We're going to go hard. And so give everything you got. And we did. I mean, we gave it everything we had left. And after we finished that drill, he said, okay, get back on the line. One more, last one, finish strong. And he did that over and over again for what felt like the last hour of that practice. And I know that man is a good Christian man, but he is a liar. And he lied to every single one of us. And I got to tell you, as much as I loved him, outside of those practices, I hated him in those moments for like 2 hours every day for 2 weeks. I just hated this guy because it felt like he hated us. It's like, why are you being so mean, and just toying with our emotions and just messing with us, right? It was just torturing us. Now, the deal with that, of course, is at the time, it felt like cruelty, but we know he was just doing his job. Right? His job was not to take it easy on us. His job was to form us into athletes who were conditioned for the physical demands of the sport. And soccer, as you know, is a very demanding sport. And he just happened to buy into that old school cliche, which I know is kind of cheesy, but you've heard it a million times. No pain, no gain. Right. Well, this is our fifth and final part in this teaching series that we started on Easter called This Is Not the End. And we started this series, if you were here back on Easter Sunday, we started by talking about this fact that with Jesus in our lives, when we come to Jesus, we give our lives to him and we begin following Jesus. He never promised that we would have a life without pain. He never made that promise. In fact, Jesus never really would or could make that kind of promise because he understood and he experienced the fact that suffering and pain is just a part of life. And so throughout this series, we've just been really kind of wrestling with this question. So where is God in the midst of all my pain and suffering and things like that? And while Jesus doesn't promise a life without pain, what he does promise is his life and his presence within our pain. And so then we started kind of building on that idea as we've been making our way through this series. And we talked about the fact that as we're following Jesus, he's not only with us in the deepest, darkest valleys of our life, but he's actually bringing us through those dark times. In fact, at times he's even carrying us through those incredibly challenging circumstances that all of us face, right? And even though bad things continue to happen, even to good people, and even though our prayers aren't always answered in the way that we would like them to be, we can still trust that God is with us and he is for us, and that there is purpose in our pain. And that's really what we've been kind of talking about these last couple of weeks through this series. And that's the idea that I want to build on a little bit more, just one more time with you together this morning, that there is purpose in our pain, or as my conditioning coach would say, no pain, no gain. Now, a lot of times when we run into these incredibly challenging moments, these painful moments in our lives, our response a lot of times is peace out. Like I didn't sign up for this. This just got way harder than I expected. And especially when it starts to hurt, like what often happens is that it kind of diverts us to what we might call the path of least resistance. And I can tell you that's exactly what I was looking for. The very next, that morning after my first conditioning practice, I was like, I don't want to go back. That was just painful and it hurt. And I think I can find easier and less painful ways to spend my free time as a college kid, But this is just a natural reaction, a natural response to pain. I mean, when something hurts, we flinch. And then we just kind of regroup, and then we kind of redirect our lives towards something that's less painful. We just naturally prefer the path of least resistance. And by the way, this whole idea or this concept of the path of least resistance, this is why rivers look the way they do. And I put a picture on the screen here for us of a river you can see that's kind of winding and twisting through the landscape there. Because one of the laws of nature is that water just naturally flows along the path of least resistance. And so that's how rivers end up looking that way. Now, that's also why, and this whole idea of the path of least resistance, sometimes our lives end up looking like that. Because sometimes it's like we reach a certain point in our lives and we're challenged in ways that we didn't expect, or maybe things just got a little bit too hard for our liking, and we might have encountered some pain through those experiences. And so we just sort of redirected our lives toward an easier path, a path of least resistance. And maybe for some of us, what this has looked like over the course of our lives is like when we've quit a job, maybe that just got too demanding. Or maybe it was, for students who might be in the room, it's when we changed majors, maybe a few times, or maybe we dropped a class because, again, it got too demanding, or it was too hard, or whatever. Maybe for others of us, it's looked like giving up on a dream. Or maybe it was leaving a relationship. Maybe even for some of us, it's looked like walking away from God and from our faith. Because at one point, those things just required more from us than we were willing to give. And so there was this pain point in front of us that we just couldn't break through. And so we changed course and we moved our lives in a different direction. But of course, it doesn't take very long before there's more challenges that come at us. And then there's another pain point standing in our way. And so we change course again. And eventually we'll do it again, and on the river flows. And so our stories start to sort of twist and turn. And at times we go sideways, and other times we get turned around. Kind of like a river winding through life along the path of least resistance. But the question that I think we need to ask ourselves in these moments is, if we keep defaulting to and deferring to the path of least resistance, if we always take the easier path, and if we're always looking for that way to avoid pain, then how will we ever grow? How will we ever get stronger? And how will we ever develop resilience? And how will we ever build character? Because, as cheesy as it is, there's a lot of truth to that statement, that without pain, there's just very little gain, and it's hard to grow without that kind of resistance in our lives. And so now I want to turn a corner with you, and I want to bring that same thinking into our spirituality. And I'm guessing that all of you are here today. In fact, the reason why you're here today is because you're on a faith journey. And I know enough of you well enough to know that's exactly why you're here. Others of you I don't know very well, but I'm just assuming the fact that you're here is because you're on a faith journey. And I know that every single one of us are at different places on this journey. And I know that some of you are well along your way. Like you've been walking with Jesus for a lot of years and you're really growing in your faith. And others of you might describe yourself as being, somewhere on the opposite end of that spectrum, maybe brand new to this, and you're growing in your faith and learning. Others of you might even say, I'm not even sure if I have faith yet. I'm still trying to explore some things and figure some things out, which is awesome. But all of us, again, we're on some sort of faith journey. And the beautiful thing about this is that when we first turn to Jesus, he accepts us as we are, just as we are. And so, no matter how broken or messed up or wounded our lives may be, he accepts us unconditionally for who we are. And then as we surrender our lives to Jesus and we decide to follow him, we begin a journey with him, a journey of healing and transformation where God begins to develop us so that we become more like his son, Jesus. But how does this work? Like, how does this work itself out in our lives, this process of transformation? Obviously, it's God in our lives who produces this transformation, but there are certain practices and experiences that all of us can embrace that sort of partner with God in the work that he wants to do in this process of becoming more like his son, Jesus. And I came across some really interesting research recently by this guy named Dr. Todd Hall, who's out of the Rosemead School of Psychology, and he published this academic work called Relational Spirituality. And what he and his team had started doing a few years ago was they wanted to discover what are the spiritual practices that lead to real change and deep change in people's lives. And so they conducted all this research and they started doing all these studies over the course of a period of time. And then they came to this conclusion, which they published in this work called Spiritual or Relational Spirituality. And they said that based on what we've discovered through this research, we can now point to 3 things that we know will lead to deep and real transformation in the life of a Jesus follower. And here are the 3 things. I'm just going to give them to you right now because I think they're fascinating. The 3 things that they discovered, they say will lead to real transformation. First of all, what they would describe as contemplative prayer. Contemplative prayer. Now, I'll say a little bit more about what they mean by contemplative before the end of the teaching this morning. But that was the first one, contemplative prayer. And then the second one is deep, long-term relationships, like lifelong friendships, deep relationships. It's so important. But then the third one, they said, and this is so fascinating, but the third thing that they say leads to real transformation in people's lives is suffering. It's suffering. And so that's the path, right? That's the path to spiritual transformation. According to their research, it's contemplative prayer, deep relationships, and suffering. Now, I want to just zoom in one last time on this idea of suffering and spend just a few more minutes talking about this with you as we bring this series to a close. But there's a person that we read about in the scriptures who just embodies this. He embodies everything that we've been talking about. We know him as the Apostle Paul, and Paul has a powerful story and just an amazing journey. And you can read all about it in the New Testament book of Acts. It's a fascinating read if you want to, if you're looking for a book in the scriptures to study. I'd recommend that one. But then, of course, you can also get a lot of it from Paul's own, firsthand perspective through the letters that he wrote throughout the first century. These letters that he wrote, which now make up almost half of our New Testament scriptures. But one of the things that we learn about Paul through his letters is that he endured some pretty intense suffering throughout his life. In fact, Paul spent years of his life in prison just for his faith in Jesus. And then on several occasions, he was beaten within an inch of his life, again, just because of his faith in Jesus. And then throughout his journeys, as he was traveling throughout the region and starting all these new churches and spreading the message of Jesus, he had been stranded at sea on more than one occasion, homeless, starving, constantly on the move. I mean, at one point, at different times, literally running for his life. Paul knew suffering. But in one of Paul's most important and influential letters, one that he wrote to the first century church in Rome, Paul talks about his perspective on suffering and what it meant to him. And when we open Romans chapter 5, Paul starts out by just rejoicing in his relationship with God. I mean, Paul, for like 2 verses, he's like gushing over the beauty that Jesus brings into our lives as a result of his peace and his grace and on and on. I mean, for 2 verses, he's going on about this. And then we get to verse 3 in chapter 5. And Paul says this. He says, we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials. And I want to pause here because other translations actually use the word suffering right here. And so as I read that, I mean, it sounds like what Paul is saying is that we can celebrate, even like shout for joy in the midst of our suffering. And so I just want to admit what I think probably a lot of us are thinking in response to this. Like, that just sounds weird. You know, it sounds strange, like it just doesn't go together, suffering and rejoicing. But we'll understand why he's saying this, I think, a little bit better as we continue reading. And verse 3 continues. Paul says, for we know that that is our suffering or our trials, help us develop endurance. And I think it's really interesting what Paul says here. I mean, just latching onto that phrase for a moment, for we know, he says. What's interesting about this is that Paul has never met the people that he's writing to. Like at this point in Paul's life, he had never been to Rome. And so he doesn't know them personally. He's never met them, but he knows enough about them. He knows that they're Christians living in the capital of the Roman Empire. And so this couldn't have been easy for them. And so he's like, listen, I don't have to tell you about trials and suffering. Like you and I, we know all about that. And that's just an assumption that he's making. It's a safe assumption. He's like, we get it. And we know, which is to say, like we have firsthand experience that our suffering is actually working. Like it's at work in our lives, developing our perseverance and developing our resilience and our endurance, Paul says. And then he goes on in verse 4 and he writes this. He says, and endurance develops strength of character, and character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. Now, when Paul talks about character in these lines here, he's not talking about the kind of character that's like what we might put on our resume. Like it's not resume character, it's more like eulogy character. And I think maybe you can appreciate the difference between those two, because what Paul is talking about here is not necessarily the things that we would list that we think describe who we are, but it's the things that people remember about us long after we're gone. You know, it's the stuff like when we're under pressure and under the pressures of life, this is what comes out of us because this is who we are. I mean, this is the character that's been tested and proven through the trials of life. Like, have you ever thought to yourself, I just wish I were more like fill in the blank, whatever that would be for you. Like, and for the sake of conversation, I thought we could just use patience as an example, because I think that's usually a pretty safe one. We could all probably use a little more patience or be a little more patient. But maybe you've actually had that thought where you thought, you know, I just wish I was more patient, or I had more patience with the people around me. Maybe you've even prayed that. And as soon as you did, it's like you found yourself in situations where that was being put to the test. You know, and if you're like me, then sometimes you don't even realize that it was you were being tested with that until you've failed the test, you know, and which is why at a very young age, I was taught to never pray for patience. You know, I think that's terrible advice, but I get it. But I had one of these experiences last weekend, a week ago Friday. So Friday and Saturday last week was our annual elders retreat. And so, you know, I spent most of that week getting ready for this elders retreat, and it was early Friday morning, and I was kind of putting some last minute thought and some things and into the material that I put together. And so I was reflecting on a passage out of John 15 that I was going to share with the elders. And somewhere in that passage, Jesus makes the statement. He says that he commands us to love one another. And I was just reflecting on that, and kind of in the moment, I was convicted and challenged by that, and I just thought, you know, I need to be a more loving person. I know that. In fact, I want to be the kind of person that others kind of experience the love of Jesus just kind of flowing through me when I'm with them. You know, I just want to be that kind of person. So I had this moment. I even might have journaled on that a little bit and was reflecting on that. And so Amanda and I left the house, and we were on our way to the house where we were hosting this elder retreat, and we had to stop at Publix on the way to get some, you know, basically the food for the weekend. And we had a lot of things, you know, a lot of items in our cart, and we're checking out. And while we're standing there at the register, I mean, I was kind of going through all the things that I still had to get ready. And there was a lot of things I wanted to have in place before the elders showed up. And I was kind of feeling that, weighing down on me. And I was also feeling a certain amount of pressure because it's my first elder retreat as the lead pastor here. And so, I just was feeling that pressure. And so I was in that moment thinking, I just want to get my stuff and get out of here. I've got a lot to do. And the sweet woman at the checkout counter, she was just a lovely person and so kind. And she wanted to have a conversation about every single item that she was scanning. And I mean, literally, it wasn't even just a comment or two. It was like, put the item down and then talk about it for a little bit with the person that she was working with and with Amanda and I, And so in that moment, I had this whole conversation with her in my mind, that was not very patient or loving. And the fact that I didn't say any of it out loud is evidence that I've grown, but it's also obviously evidence that I've got a long way to go. A long way to go. And I didn't even realize until probably a couple of hours later as we were talking about this with the elders, and I thought, that was a test. It was a trial. And I wasn't even ready for it. My mind and my heart just wasn't even there. And here's the deal. God won't let us stop at just wishing for more faith or just praying for godly character and integrity or simply musing about being a more patient and loving and generous person. He's going to test those things and develop those qualities in us. And he uses trials and even suffering to accomplish that. And so here's what I believe Paul is trying to teach us in these two verses that we've just looked at out of Romans chapter 5. And it's a lesson that I know so many of you have learned and you are living in your day-to-day lives, because here's what I believe Paul is saying. Our transformation is forged through trials. Our transformation is forged through trials, and Paul rejoices in this. He rejoices in this because Paul is like, listen, I know life is going to get messy. That's just reality, right? It's going to happen. Suffering is always going to make its way into our stories. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter where you live. It doesn't matter what you do. There's no way around this. But Paul would say, since I've trusted Jesus Christ with my life, and I've placed my life in his hands, I see his hand at work in the messes of my life. And I am a stronger and more mature and more Christ-like person because of the difficulties that I've had to endure, Paul says. And here's the reality. And again, I know you already know this because you're living it. But the reality is that suffering changes you. It changes you. It just does. You cannot walk through a season of suffering without it leaving a mark on you in some way. And that's exactly what Douglas talked about last week. These wounds that heal into scars that show the marks and leave the marks of the trials and the challenges and the difficulties that we've faced throughout our journey. But for the follower of Jesus, we have this hope that there is purpose in our pain. Because God wants to use those trials to transform us and grow us and develop us into people who are more loving and kind and patient and generous, just like his son, Jesus. John Ortberg, who's a former pastor now, but he's an author and a speaker, he said it this way one time. He said, God isn't at work producing the circumstances you want. God is at work in bad circumstances, producing the you he wants. But for any of us, and it doesn't matter if you're a follower of Jesus or not, for any one of us, suffering also has the potential to destroy us. It has the potential to send us sideways in our lives and meandering through life, angry and bitter and cynical, living joyless and hopeless lives. Suffering changes you one way or the other. So the question is, will your trials make you better or bitter? Will your suffering make you stronger or cynical? Will your difficulties develop you or derail you? And the answer to those questions rests in whether or not you and I will surrender our hardships and our troubles and our pain to the one who wants to use these trials to do a triumphant work of transformation in our souls. because our transformation is forged through trials. And I know that so many of us are walking through serious trials right now. And when I think about what some of you are dealing with and have been walking through just in the last few weeks and months, really just in the past year, I mean, any suffering that I've experienced just seems so small in comparison. And just off the top of my head, as I was putting these thoughts together for this morning, I mean, I know that there's so many, it seems, who are walking through the pain of tragedy and loss. Those of you who are facing significant challenges with family members, personal struggles, and really just the general disappointment that life has not turned out the way that we hoped or expected that it would. And those are very real trials that bring so much pain and suffering into our stories. And then this past week, again, just putting together some thoughts for this morning, I decided to go back to those strips of cloth that you wrote on and left on the cross Easter Sunday. Do you remember that? And those of you who weren't here, just a little context. I mean, at the close of that service, we were invited to just write something on that piece of cloth, that's something that we feel is holding us back and really keeping us from stepping into the life that Jesus offers and invites us into. And so we wrote that on the piece of cloth and we left that on the cross. And I just, I went back through every single one of those and just looked back over. And I tell you, I got a little emotional as I read through and I prayed through the struggles that you wrote down on those pieces of cloth. I mean, so many of you wrote down the struggle of not feeling good enough. I mean, that was expressed in a variety of ways, but just this idea of feeling like you don't measure up or that you're just not enough. Others of you mentioned the pain of addictions that you're battling. Anxiety and depression was another major common thread through those. Others wrote down issues like mother and father wounds and loneliness and fear and worry, sometimes in very specific ways. And again, all very real and painful trials and brokenness that so many of us are experiencing and walking through right now. I love what author and speaker Lisa TerKeurst once said in response to some significant challenges that she has faced in her story. And she said this, she said, "What if this painful breaking is a part of a beautiful remaking?" And I know that's what this feels like when we're walking through and carrying this kind of stuff with us in our story, this pain and these trials. I mean, it feels like it's breaking us. We feel broken. And I believe wholeheartedly that God wants to work in those broken places to begin a beautiful remaking in our lives. Because our transformation is forged through trials just like these. So here's what I want to invite you to do this morning. And this is kind of the response, the opportunity to respond really to this teaching, but also just to the entire series. And there's really two parts to this. But the next step for us this morning is to bring others into your pain and give your trials to God. Bring others into your pain and give your trials to God. And so what we want to do as we close the service this morning is we just want to provide a little space for you to be able to actually do those things. If whatever work you need to do with God right now, we want to give you the time and the space to do that. And so Taylor's going to come up and he's going to sing a song for us. And, this isn't meant to be necessarily a moment where we stand together and we sing along like we did earlier in the service. But really, again, we just wanted to create a space where we can provide an atmosphere for you to reflect and just allow the Spirit of God to speak to you and do a work in your heart this morning. As you remember from earlier in the teaching, I mentioned from the research, these three things that they've identified lead to real transformation in our lives, and suffering was just one of them. But deep relationships was another. And the reality is, we need others with us on this journey. And we talk about this all the time at Cypress because it is so important to bring others into our journeys and to bring others into our pain. I was having coffee with Pastor Douglas this past Monday. And he asked me a very simple question. He asks me every time we get together. He just said, "How can we be praying for you and Amanda right now?" And so I just decided to open up and just share with him a trial that we're walking through right now. And as I started talking about it, it's like I couldn't even get through a whole sentence before I felt just the wave of emotion begin to kind of well up within me. And in that moment, as I was talking about this and sharing this with Douglas, it just felt so cathartic just to name that trial and to say out loud how difficult it's been and the pain that it's brought into our lives. But also in that moment, I mean, what was so healing and so life-giving about that is just knowing that someone's praying for us. Someone's standing with us and beside us, and they're sharing their life experiences with us. And that is so important, and we all need that. And so if you haven't yet, I mean, if you're walking through something, a trial or a challenge or just a difficulty in your life, and you haven't brought someone else into that pain with you yet, then I want to give you a moment to do that this morning before you leave. And so what we're going to do while Taylor is singing the song, and I know this is going to require a little bit of boldness and a little bit of courage, but I'm going to be sitting in one of those chairs over there by the window on this side. We've got a couple of elders, Mark and Frank, who are going to be sitting on at the windows over on that side. And this is an opportunity for you just to come forward and just briefly share with us, this is what I'm walking through. This is a trial that I'm facing right now. And then let us pray for you. Very briefly, it doesn't have to be complicated, maybe just over the course of 30 seconds. And then you can return to your seat. But if that's something you need this morning, we just want to give you that opportunity. So deep relationships, suffering, but then the third thing that was part of that list was what they called contemplative prayer. And by contemplative prayer, what they really mean is just sitting in quiet, reflective solitude with your thoughts just fixed on who God is and his presence in your life and his activity through the course of your life. And really it's this moment where you can just quiet yourself in the presence of God to hear from him. Maybe through a thought or a picture that comes to mind, which is so often how he speaks to us. But it's also in these moments of quiet, reflective prayer that we have the opportunity to just pour our hearts out to him in just honest and unfiltered and raw expression to God. And so again, we wanted to create a moment where you can do that in your seats as Taylor is singing this song, and just really, again, to just create this atmosphere of reflection where you can just allow God to speak to you and you can just pour your heart out to him. And listen, it's okay to be brutally honest with God in your prayers. It's okay to tell him exactly how you're feeling. You can tell him, God, I hate what I'm going through right now. I hate what that person did to me. I hate what happened to my loved one. I hate this pain that you've allowed into my life, God. And I'm angry. And I'm heartbroken. As you open your heart to him this morning, then let this be a moment where you just then take whatever it is that's weighing on you, whatever trials you've been walking through, and just say, God, here they are. This is the pain that I'm feeling right now. This is the suffering that I'm walking through and the trials that I'm facing. And I just want to give it to you, God. And in that moment, let him remind you that he knows exactly how you feel. And he knows exactly what you're walking through. And he sees you and he weeps for you and he's walking with you and bringing you through this incredibly dark and painful valley. And then just ask him, God, how do you want to use these trials in my life to shape me and to form me? How are you building me up? How are you remaking me through this painful breaking? Over these next few moments, I just invite you to allow the Holy Spirit to move and to speak to you as you bring others into your pain and as you give your trials to God. Father, would you speak to us and move in this space and in each of our hearts over these next few moments? In Jesus' name.